Welcome to Mktg 305, Consumer Behavior for Level 300 Distance Students. In this section, I intend to take you through an introduction to consumer behavior. Today's marketplace is complex and dynamic, and for businesses to be profitable and stay above competition, they need to make the customer the focal point of all marketing actions in terms of the deployment of the marketing mix elements. This section will seek to introduce students to how the discipline of consumer behavior was developed and why prudent marketers rely on consumer insight or knowledge in taking important marketing and business decisions. Hence, prudent marketers or businesses must understand possibly all the questions or issues bordering on consumer behavior in relation to customer satisfaction. In terms of outline, I'll tell you how the field of consumer behavior was developed. In the process, we'll explain the strategic importance of consumer behavior. And of course, today, winning philosophy as far as marketing and business is concerned is the marketing concept. Our attempt to make you understand how this concept came to be well accepted by businesses the world over. And if time will permit, I will take you through some basic concepts in marketing. By way of reading list, I expect all students to read the introductory chapter of the text listed at the end of these slides. Other important materials that relates to this course, I will attempt to send to students via Sakai mode of learning. Like I said earlier on, the nature of today's marketplace demands that business decision makers understand the consumer if they are to achieve the firm's sales and marketing strategy. It's important. Businesses of yesteryears are quite faced, and that of today vary in terms of the challenges they face. So for firms to succeed, so to speak, they need to be able to figure out virtually everything there is to know by way of strategy development. The course will expose you to various influences that affect the consumer in his or consumption-related decision. As you appreciate with time, there are multiplicity of factors that influence consumption-related decision-making. But for our purposes, we'll limit it to what we'll later call the personal or the psychological influences. And of course, because the consumer operates within a socio-cultural context, we also look at issues that relates to the socio-cultural environment. So like I'm trying to explain to you, knowledge of consumer behavior will provide you with the necessary insights for devising appropriate marketing and sales strategy. Of course, as marketers, although we do a lot of SWOT analysis and other issues, we are mostly guided by the 4P or the 7P framework. In other words, when we gain appropriate insight, it will help us devise appropriate marketing mix, which we normally refer to as the 4Ps or the 7Ps of marketing. Of course, as you expect, the multiplicity of definitions, or several definitions have been put forward by scholars. But the one that I find interesting is that put forward by my good friend Schiffman and Canuck. So we'll look at this definition briefly and we'll explain the key issues therein. According to Schiffman and Canuck, 2007, they defined consumer behavior as the behavior that consumers display in searching for, purchasing, using, evaluating, and disposing of goods and services that they expect will satisfy their need. This very definition will tell you that consumer behavior is goal-driven and is aimed at need satisfaction. But like I said, this definition we find useful because it does not only border on purchase, the art of purchasing. It starts from the very beginning. Typical marketers are interested in what the consumer does before purchase, what he does during purchase, and what he does post-purchase, because a typical consumer may develop what we call cognitive dissonance. So marketers should be interested in this entire process towards customer need satisfaction. Talking about consumers, we use the word consumers to refer to two broad entities. We can talk of the personal consumer or the organizational consumer. By personal consumer, we are interested in those entities or persons who buy goods and services to satisfy their own needs or the needs of their families or other members within their socio-cultural bracket. Of course, the organizational consumer comes in when we buy same goods and services for the furtherance of our business or for production purposes. So the same consumer may buy, let's say, a laptop if he uses it for his personal, at home, or use it for his, he allows his children to use it. That will fall under personal consumption of that laptop. The same laptop, if it's purchased to help in business, let's say a small business set up by the same person, that will fall under organizational consumption. But for the purposes of our discussion, I want you to focus on the personal consumer, because we see the personal consumption or personal consumer as more pervasive. So a good appreciation of personal consumption will also help us relate or explain organizational behavior. These days, you realize that all companies are making claims that they are customer-focused, marketing-oriented, and so on and so forth. But the situation was different in the past. Mostly, it has to do with the relationship between demand and supply. In the past, let's say around the 1950s, consumer behavior as a discipline became necessary and, of course, became popular around that time. This time, businesses realized or welcomed the idea that the key to become successful in business is to identify the needs of target markets and satisfy them better than competitors. You will agree with me that we can talk of issues of competition in virtually all product categories. Talking about the real estate, business education, talking about, personal electronic goods and services, talking about banking and so on. So marketers can no longer afford to practice what we call the leaky bucket approach. Where demand always exceeded supply. So businesses could afford to not pay too much attention to the peculiar needs of customers, but that is not the case. Business will not survive if they fail to focus on the consumer. It's important that we note that consumer behavior as a business subject has borrowed extensively from other behavioral sciences, because like we said, we are interested in gaining insight about consumers for gaining marketplace acceptance and profitability. Being a behavioral science, it has borrowed extensively from other behavioral sciences. The discipline of consumer behavior has been shaped largely by subject areas like psychology, which we know has to do with how individuals make decisions. Of course, we are in marketing, so we try to relate it to the marketplace decision making. We borrow theories like issue of motivation, which is essentially a needs construct, because we say behavior is goal-driven. So for us to understand consumers, we need to understand issues that borders on consumer motivation These are, of course, issues of learning, how consumers acquire marketplace information for future decision making. We've borrowed theories and concepts from psychology, issue of motivation. We look at Maslow hierarchy of needs. Come to how consumers learn. We've borrowed ideas in terms of classical conditioning, operant, and what we call the instrumental learning theories. Of course, cognitive schools of thought, as far as how consumers learn, all come from the area of psychology. And because no consumer is an island, we all operate within a socio-cultural bracket. So again, we accept the fact that our actions as consumers are also influenced by other dynamics in the socio-cultural environment. So here again, we've borrowed ideas from sociology and so on and so forth. And of course, economics. I mean, resources will remain limited. So issue of pricing and how consumers make decisions when faced with limited resources and so on and so forth. So economics has also been useful. We cannot discuss business without talking about the cultural issues. So again, we've borrowed concepts or theories from anthropology, which essentially has to do with issue of culture, because the consumer typically sees the world through his or her cultural lenses. So briefly, this is what we can say about the interdisciplinary nature of consumer behavior. So it has borrowed, it's a rich subject area which has borrowed extensively from other areas. Now, what does the marketing concept say? I won't bother you, I won't try to take you to the genesis or the development of the concept. But what this concept simply says is that the key to marketplace survival is to focus all marketing decisions on the consumer. It's as simple as that. If the consumer is that important, and today we are faced with competition in all spheres of business, then the key to marketplace survival is to focus all marketing actions on the consumer. In other words, the way we deploy the element of the marketing mix has to be informed by insights gained from our target market, i.e. the consumer. Of course, we've talked about the production concept and all that. This was a period that was characterized by excessive demand over supply. So in that case, in a scenario like this, you realize that businesses, the main focus becomes how to ensure production efficiency. Consumers at the time were not that sophisticated. So they wanted generic goods at cheaper prices. So businesses at the time, were always looking for how to look for more efficient ways of producing what consumers want, without actually paying attention on the peculiarities or the dynamic nature of the needs of the consumer. Of course, we've come a long way. These days, competition all over. So firms can no longer afford to practice what I call the leaky bucket approach to marketing. In other words, you don't care the number of customers you lose because there's overwhelming demand. But these days, tell me which sector, look at the various sectors, there's competition over. You come to banking, you come to consumer electronics, you come to business education, you come to fashion, you name it. There's competition all over. So prudent marketers are expected to channel their energies towards understanding the intricate nuances of the consumer. Of course, there's no art to find a man's construction in the face. But consumer behavior studies, it's not, there's nothing precise about trying to study human beings, because even as consumers, sometimes we are unable to explain why we act the way we do. But we believe that good knowledge of consumer behavior will increase the chances that we'll come out with solutions or brands or goods and services to satisfy consumers, because consumers are being influenced by multiple set of factors. Of course, the pestle factors all influence consumer behavior. Of course, the political system we have will shape or will influence what can be produced and consumed. The economic environment will also affect disposable income and so on and so forth. Of course, the sociocultural environment, the state of technology will also influence the kind of demands consumers make in the marketplace, and of course their expectation in terms of preferences and so on and so forth. Of course, the legal regime will also influence what consumers will demand, because it will determine what can be produced and so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, the marketing concept has become the winning philosophy of business now, and prudent organizations tend to imbibe and hold on in terms of strategy. So as you can see per this arrow, some authorities mention the product orientation, they mention the sales orientation, the market orientation, and so on and so forth. But what is important is that the marketplace has changed so much that many businesses have imbibed the marketing orientation to doing business, and that will require that we study consumer behavior for decision making. So when you look at this slide, it gives you a kind of snapshot on what we mean by production orientation, which is the first business orientation. We can talk of the sales orientation. That one too, when you look at it, it will give you an idea of what the situation was and what businesses were doing. And the marketing orientation or customer focus orientation.